May I have a moment of your time, please? It's about your mother. The doctor, pulling my arm, looked deeply troubled. My mother has been wheelchair bound for 10 years, regularly visiting the hospital for checkups and rehabilitation. Today, like any other day, we came for her tests, and she's currently being examined. While waiting for her rehabilitation session, this doctor pulled me aside. I'll hear about my mother from her regular doctor. I gently shook off the doctor's hand from my right arm. The doctor in front of me is a woman, but my mother's regular doctor is a man. I haven't heard of any changes. Why is a doctor who isn't her regular talking to me about my mother? Looking skeptically, the female doctor in front of me clasped my hands with both of hers. It's a matter I can't discuss with your mother or her doctor. I need to tell you alone. Just me? I took a step towards the female doctor, who looked at me with a serious expression. I am Hannah, a 35-year-old single office worker. I work for a major corporation, but currently I'm working remotely for a certain reason. I've been raised by a single mother since before I can remember. My parents divorced when I was very young, and I don't even remember what my father looked like. All I know is that his name was Ryan. According to my mother, my father was a good-for-nothing. He treated her like a slave and left with a younger woman, saying he was bothered by having a child. I've never been able to contact him, and all his photos were discarded by my mother. After the divorce, my mother easily won custody, given the circumstances. She worked late nights, raising me as a single mother, for which I'm immensely grateful. Thanks to her, I could attend college and land a job at a major corporation. Having received so much love from her, I never felt lonely growing up with a single mother. I've never had the desire to meet my father. My mother always said, "That man was truly hopeless, so Hannah, you should think you never had a father." When I first heard about how he treated her and his infidelity, I couldn't contain my anger towards him. So I never envied my friends whose parents attended school events together. As my mother advised, I hardly ever thought about my father, and started living alone as soon as I got a job. I was busy, but lived a fulfilling life until a turning point came when I was 25. My mother was involved in a traffic accident, leading to a life bound to a wheelchair. Unable to walk, she had to quit her job, and the always cheerful mother began to lose her smile and became withdrawn. Her mental health deteriorated, and despite having many helpers, none seemed to be a good match, and she became severely emaciated. Worried by her repeated requests for me to return home, I decided to move back to take care of her. I planned to use my leave for about a week to focus on caregiving, thinking to return once she got better. She seemed reassured by my return, showing smiles after a few days. But when I mentioned returning to my job soon, she completely changed. "No, Hannah, please don't go back. Don't leave me alone." She cried hysterically, clinging to me. "Mom, calm down. I understand. I'll talk to my office again." Confused but unable to turn my back on the mother who raised me alone, I decided to stay. She had always been apprehensive about me living alone. Maybe living together again made her fear loneliness more. Her weakening legs and depressed state must be hard on her. I discussed with my company and decided to switch to remote work, working shorter hours until my mother's condition improved. But since then, my mom has been avoiding being alone at all costs. Even when I'm working remotely, she always wants to be right by my side, clinging to me. No matter how much I love her, there are things I can't show to anyone but my coworkers, so I had to ask her to leave the room. But she would always wait somewhere where she could see into my room. I felt like I was always being watched, and I hated myself for thinking that way. Mom kept going to the hospital for rehab, but her leg wasn't getting any better. This meant I had no prospect of returning to the main office. My personal life was all about caring for her, so I hadn't met anyone new and didn't have a boyfriend. This lifestyle was now going into its 10th year. Now my mom is 60, and it seems like her dependency on me is getting worse as she gets older. Whenever I leave the house for a bit, like to go shopping, she panics and insists on coming along. It takes so much time to calm her down. Living alone again just isn't an option. There was no way I could abandon my mother, who has loved and raised me since I was a child. Then, one day, today was her regular checkup, and I always accompany her to the hospital. Her doctor, Daniel, a man in his 40s, has been treating her for 10 years, and I trust him completely. After Mom went into the examination room, I stepped outside the hospital to handle some work calls. When I returned about 10 minutes later, a doctor stopped me. "Excuse me, you're Madison's daughter, right?" Madison is my mom's name. The doctor, who appeared to be around my age, was a woman named Amelia. She recently started working at the hospital and works in the same department as Daniel, my mom's doctor. Surprised, I replied, "Yes, that's me. Is there something wrong?" "Do you have a moment? I actually need to talk to you about your mother." "About my mom? Sure, I don't mind." I nodded, assuming the examination wasn't over yet. Amelia then led me to a small private room near the examination rooms, seemingly used for consultations. I took a seat as she suggested, and Amelia, sitting across a small table, looked straight at me and asked, "So you're back at your parents' house, taking care of Madison, right?" Yeah, that's right." I told Amelia that I've been working from home while taking care of my mom for the past 10 years. Since I moved back home, I hardly had any chance to hang out with friends, and I never talked to anyone else about it. Amelia listened quietly, nodding, and I found myself venting about my daily frustrations. "I'm sorry for rambling on like this." "It's okay. So it's been 10 years? She smiled kindly at me, and then seemed to ponder something looking down. When she looked up, her expression was serious, and she started to speak. But what reached my ears wasn't Amelia's words, but my mother's scream. Rushing to the door, what I saw left me speechless. And Amelia, slowly shaking her head, said, "You need to leave your parents' house right now. You have to get away from your mother." Her words left me speechless, and I could only nod silently, holding back a surge of anger. Without going back to my mother, I returned home. As soon as I got back, I started packing my things in a hurry. The image of my mom at the hospital was still fresh in my mind. 2 hours later, I was still packing. My phone kept ringing with calls from Mom. She must be panicking because I hadn't shown up after her appointments. But I ignored the constant ringing and only answered in the evening when I had finished packing.
"Hannah, where are you? I've called so many times. Why didn't you answer?"
As soon as the call connected, my mom yelled at me. Normally, I would apologize immediately. "Where am I? I'm home." But this time, I replied indifferently.
"You left me and went home first? Why would you do that?"
My mom was almost hysterical, screaming at me. Sighing, I said, "Mom, I can't live with you anymore, so I'm leaving the house." And with that, I firmly told her my decision.
What are you thinking? If you were gone, I couldn't go on living. How do you expect me to get home from the hospital?"
"Why don't you walk home? Your legs have been fine for a while now. You don't really need the wheelchair or the care, do you?" When I continued like this, my mother let out a short cry, sounding almost like a scream. I could picture her terribly upset. "I found out everything that you've been hiding, Mom." I told my mother about what Amelia had shared with me and what I had witnessed myself at the hospital. According to Amelia, recent tests showed no abnormalities in my mother's muscles, bones, or nerves. She came up with the idea that it might be a psychological issue. My mother had convinced herself she couldn't walk, and therefore she really couldn't. The power of belief is not to be underestimated, and they were considering focusing not just on physical therapy, but also on mental health care. That's why they called me, a family member, to discuss incorporating emotional support into her rehabilitation. But at that moment, a woman's scream came from the direction of the examination room.
Ah!
Was that Mom's voice? Amelia and I exchanged glances, then hurried to check the examination room. There was a window through which we could see inside the room, and my mother was there, waving her hands as if to shoo away insects. Indeed, the scream was hers. But why would there be bugs in the examination room? It turned out she had mistaken some dust for something else. She threw away the motionless dust in the bin herself. What? Without a wheelchair, without a cane, she walked briskly over to the trash can. Amelia pushed me to the corner of the hallway. Peeking out, it seemed my mother hadn't noticed us at all. She walked back to her wheelchair as if it was the most natural thing and sat down calmly. Passing by where we were hiding, Daniel entered the examination room and approached my mother, offering his hand. My mother placed a brown envelope in his palm. Daniel pocketed it, then pushed the wheelchair as if nothing had happened, taking my mother to the rehabilitation facility. "Hannah, are you okay?" I was dumbstruck, and it wasn't until Amelia spoke to me softly that I came back to my senses. It wasn't that she couldn't walk, nor was it that she thought she couldn't walk. She could walk, but pretended she couldn't. Amelia hugged my trembling shoulders and shook her head slowly. "Get away from home now. Escape from your mother." Following her advice, I finished packing to escape from my mother. Throughout my story, my mother was silent. Then, a deep sigh came through the phone, and she began to speak the truth, as if she could no longer deny it. "It's true that I was in a traffic accident and was injured badly enough to need care. But thanks to rehabilitation, I could walk with a cane 2 years after the accident." Hearing this, I was shocked. Just 2 years to recover? Then what was the 10 years I spent caring for my mother? "But I was afraid that if you knew I could walk, you would leave me, Hannah. I couldn't bear that," she selfishly claimed. I knew very well from her daily behavior that my mother doted on me, so she made me take care of her, binding me so I couldn't go anywhere. "I love you more than anyone. I was lonely." Even after being told so many times by my mother, my heart remained unmoved. For these 10 years, many of my colleagues at work have been promoted and some have gotten married. I gave up my career and marriage for you, Mom. I've essentially wasted 10 years. Why did you lie and make me take care of you? I kept in touch and came home on my days off. Why did it have to come to this?" As I accused my mother, tears began to overflow, and finally, I told her that I had no intention of taking care of her anymore. And in the end, "I'm leaving home today. Don't ever contact me again," I said, rejecting my mother. My mother was still ranting incoherently, but I cut off the call without paying any attention. A month later, living alone again, I was at a certain hospital. I was about to leave after my appointment. A familiar figure rushed towards me. It was Daniel, who was supposed to be my mother's doctor. He looked more haggard than I remembered, his cheeks sunken and fatigue emanating from his entire body. Wondering why he was at this hospital, I was about to refuse to talk, but he approached me with such desperation that I reluctantly listened. Then, he confessed that he had known all along that my mother's legs were healed, and had diagnosed her as physically disabled in exchange for money from her. The envelope my mother gave him that day had also contained cash. He had been fired shortly after Amelia reported him to the hospital. Furthermore, he was about to be arrested for continuously falsifying medical records, and his medical license was almost certainly going to be revoked. However, he insisted, "I've done nothing wrong." Incredibly, Daniel claimed that the money was not a gratuity from my mother, but hush money from me. He said I had planned to defraud disability pensions by making my mother appear disabled, and had coerced and bribed him into writing the necessary documents. Of course, this was completely false. It was Daniel who had extended his hand to my mother at that time. Unbelievable that he would try to shift all the blame onto me now that he was facing arrest. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything like that."
"No, that's the truth. I'll tell the police everything without hiding anything,"
Daniel shouted, his eyes bloodshot, and I turned pale. There was not a shred of evidence in Daniel's story, but it was also difficult for me to prove that I had nothing to do with them. As I was turning white, fearing being asked to prove a negative, a man approached me. He stood in front of me as if to protect me from Daniel.
"You are the hospital's director, aren't you? Oh, excuse me. I have something to discuss."
At the sight of the man, Daniel's face turned ashen. He approached with a forced smile, rubbing his hands together, but the man frowned and glared at him.
What are you going to do to my daughter? What, daughter?
The man Daniel glared at was the director of this hospital and, as it turned out, my father, Brian. Yes, my father, who divorced my mother when I was young. Actually, my father was a doctor. After the divorce, my father had risen through the ranks and was now the director of a major hospital. He was also one of the people who had agreed to revoke Daniel's medical license upon learning of his deeds.
Oh, your family. Then please, let's talk. I was coerced by her to write the diagnosis. It must be hard for a father to see his daughter become a criminal, right? Could you please put in a good word for me?
Daniel apologized deeply on the spot and begged my father for mercy. But my father shook his head sternly.
Don't be ridiculous. You and the hospital, the administration, have all been deceiving a daughter who cared for her mother for 10 years. Madison to keep her daughter tied to her home, to receive disability pensions, and you, to pay off gambling debts. You fraudsters deserve to be punished.
I firmly dismissed Daniel's appeal.
Damn it.
Realizing he was helpless, Daniel collapsed right there. The surrounding glances gathered noisily, and I could only watch his form with indescribable feelings. Then suddenly, I was yanked hard from behind. Surprised, I turned around, and there was my mother, standing firmly on both feet, with a terrifying expression.
You! What are you doing to Hannah?
She screamed, glaring at my father. Mom, why are you here?
Because I knew Daniel was looking for you. I followed him. I thought it would lead me to you.
My mother's obsession with finding me was intense, and it sent shivers of fear down my spine.
Give Hannah back to me. I won't let her go to someone like you. Hannah, let's escape quickly.
My mother, screaming at my father, had an unprecedented, ferocious look. I shook off her hand and yelled, Stop it! I know that all the stories you told me about Dad were lies. As I said this, my mother's expression changed, and she began to look unsettled. In truth, my mother had been feeding me lies since the divorce to prevent me from wanting to see my father. The stories about my father treating her like a slave and leaving her for a younger woman were all false. My father, an excellent doctor, had always been incredibly busy and knew little rest. Despite knowing this, my mother's attitude changed drastically after giving birth to me. She blamed him for his frequent absences and for the rarity of family vacations, and decided to divorce him, claiming he wasn't a good father. On my 3rd birthday, my mother suddenly took me and left the house. In reality, it was my mother who left, not my father. After the divorce, my mother received custody because my father, despite having a sufficient income, didn't have the time for childcare. However, my father had been sending a significant amount of child support every month. I had no idea about this and only recently found out after talking to my father. Becoming a single mother, my mother gradually became more dependent on me, and, to ensure I wouldn't go to my economically stable father, filled me with lies about him being a no-good man. My father had repeatedly expressed his desire to see me, and asked for visits, but my mother refused, claiming I didn't want to meet him. There were times when a meeting seemed possible, but either my father was called away for emergencies, or my mother would suddenly cancel for some reason, preventing us from ever meeting. I was told that my father had disappeared when I was young, but that too was a lie. The reason my mother didn't return to her parents' house as a single mother and managed to send me to high school and university was because of the child support and living expenses from my father, allowing us to live comfortably. So the story of my mother working hard late into the night for my upbringing was also a lie. In reality, she worked part-time during the day and spent her nights freely, returning home late to make me believe she was diligently taking care of me.
My proof is,
my mother said weakly.
I can prove the child support and tuition I've been transferring.
To which my father responded. My mother slumped down, utterly defeated. Seeing her like that, I realized I had been living in a world of my mother's lies since I was a child. I was shocked when I first learned the truth, but now I feel more anger than anything. Thank you for everything until now, but it's over, I said coldly, and my mother clung to me.
Well, wait, Hannah, I did it all for you.
Not for me, but for yourself, right? You got a lot of money and pretended to be a struggling single mother, Was it fun destroying your daughter's 10 years with lies? I can't trust you anymore. Never get involved with me or Dad again. I declared our estrangement, leaving the hospital with my father, leaving my mother standing there speechless. Later, Daniel was arrested and his medical license revoked. He was imprisoned for repeatedly forging medical records, and the hospital he worked for demanded a large sum of money for tarnishing its reputation. Moreover, my mother, who had bribed the doctor for false diagnosis, was ordered by the administration to return all the pensions she had received, with interest, and was also charged with fraud. What life my mother will lead from now on is no longer my concern, as I have severed ties with her. As for me, unknowingly becoming dependent on my mother and being betrayed by her, I was mentally devastated and had to seek treatment at a major hospital. I reconnected with my father while getting a referral letter written. He remembered me when he saw my full name and was happy to learn he hadn't been forgotten. Currently, I have returned to work at the head office, balancing my job and hospital visits. Later, I met with Amelia, who revealed the truth about my mother to thank her, and we exchanged contact details. Being of a similar age, we now occasionally meet for coffee. It's refreshing and enjoyable to chat like this with someone other than my mother. I also regularly keep in touch with my father, reclaiming our parent-child time. I'm going to see a movie with Amelia soon. I haven't been to the movies with anyone in about 10 years, so I'm really looking forward to it. I reported this to my father during a dinner after work one day. He smiled gently and said,
"From now on, live your life the way you want, Hannah."
I nodded deeply. Going forward, I plan to live a fun and fulfilling life, considering my future.